Today, I am happy to moderate and announce Deborah McNelis, who has her master's in education, is an author, speaker, and creator of Neuro-Nurturing. As an early brain development specialist and founder of the first 60-day founder of Brain Insights LLC, she has developed the unique Neuro-Nurturing Interaction Series and the First 60 Days booklet. She has initiated the First 60 Days movement in an effort to create an understanding of the significant impact of the first 2 months of life. Additionally, she has published Transitions and Balanced Stimulation development packets in a collaboration with Redleaf Press. She has been seen in publications, heard on radio interviews, webinars worldwide, and received rave reviews for her engaging and insightful presentations and keynotes for community, schools, organizations, and companies. And now she's here to share with us and the world at this conference. So, Deborah, I will leave the screen, but I will be here for you, and we look forward to your wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I appreciate the warm welcome and introduction, and I just want to say hello to everyone. I love presenting in person best, so it's hard not to see you. But I'm glad you can see me. And yeah, when we do virtual, at least we are making broader connections, right? So for those of you that arrived a little bit early and Stephanie and I were chatting, I was commenting on how wonderful this group of people is and making a difference in this world. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to share with you. And so I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation and get started. All right, so the title is Neuro-Nurturing, the Impact of the First 60 Days. And I will explain a little bit about what the term neuro-nurturing means, and we'll get into what the impact of the first 60 days is. So I want to start by saying we have an incredible opportunity. So when I started getting into this work of sharing information on early brain development, the emphasis was on the first 5 years, that we have this incredible opportunity to really make a positive impact on the lives of children during the ages of birth to 5. Those are, and they still are, the time of most rapid growth and development of the brain. And then there was an emphasis that came out on, well, you know, those first 1,000 days really have a great emphasis and significance in positive development. And now, since 2018, research was done that's showing that now it's especially significant in the first 60 days. So again, I will get into more detail about that. But the point is that we do have an incredible opportunity for influencing children positively. And through the work that you do, that's you're, as I said, making that difference in the world. So here's a little bit. Stephanie did an introduction about me. This is just a collage that shows a little bit about me. And just to give you a little more background, is that I started as an early child with a bachelor's in early childhood education, and I started by teaching kindergarten. And the reason I bring that up is because at that time, and it was many years ago, as we were talking about, I was young watching Romper Room as a little girl. So this was many years ago that I got my bachelor's degree, and the emphasis was, or the information was all based on theory and behavioral studies. Because the technology wasn't as advanced as it is now, we didn't know a lot about what was actually going on in young children's brains. So fast forward, I taught kindergarten for about 10 years and did some other things around focusing on children and parenting and throughout my career. But then in the 90s, which is referred to sometimes, you've probably heard called the Decade of the Brain, and the technology was more advanced, and we were able to begin seeing what is going on in these young children's brains and what has the most positive influence. So as I learned that and tried to absorb everything I could as that information was coming out, I thought, well, the world needs to know this. So I started, I worked for an advocacy agency at that point, doing presentations on early brain development. And then about 4 years into that, the funding, it was a nonprofit, and the funding ran out for that program. So I said, well, I can't not do this. I have to do this. So that's when I started my own company called Brain Insights, giving insights into the way that children's brains develop, but in very simple, understandable layman's terms, not high-level neuroscience terminology. So that's just giving you a little bit of background of how I got to this point. And what I found along the way is that sometimes hearing the term brain development can be somewhat off-putting because people are thinking it's going to be high levels of neuroscience. But so I thought, well, maybe we need a different term to talk about this. So I came up with the term neuro-nurturing, because the other part of the term brain development is sometimes people have the association that, oh, brain development, that means building the intelligence of a child or pushing as much academic knowledge into a child's brain as possible and as early as possible. So I wanted to convey that developing a child's brain is developing that whole child, and we need to do it through nurturing. So that's where that term neuro-nurturing comes from. So just to give you, like I said, an overview of where I'm coming from as I share this information with you. So I want to recognize to begin with that you are, as I've said already, extremely important, because sharing your knowledge, your experience, and your understanding leads to confidence for those parents that you are reaching and influencing, the parents of the babies that you are working with. So the basis of this presentation is to share information that can be helpful and hopefully enhance the information that you are sharing with parents. Some of it you likely already know, but this is focused on sharing ways of sharing that information with the parents that you're interacting with or influencing. Because what children need most is adults that understand development, right? They need the adults in their lives to have that understanding so that they can provide all that a child actually needs. So, but you've probably run across this, that there are far too many commonly shared myths, theories, and misconceptions, right? Likely that you've seen that. Is it frustrating to you to see this? Things like, don't do this and do this, and should a baby be doing tummy time or not? Should I let my baby cry it out? All those kinds of things are all over the place, and there's opinions and thoughts and theories on all of that. So what I have done is I have created a booklet called The First 60 Days, and it is based on 22 of those very common myths and misconceptions. And it is shared throughout this booklet with the myth, the baby's perspective of the myth, and then the neuro-nurturing knowledge, all based in simple, understandable terms, and all based on scientific research. So that's what this presentation is based on. I'm going to share some of those myths and then some of that neuro-nurturing knowledge and the supporting information. So as I said, this is information that you can then share with those that you influence. So science helps us to create needed assurance, developmentally appropriate expectations, and advantageous practices. So that's what science does for us. Again, it's not theory. It's not someone's opinion. It's scientifically researched information. And that provides, as I said, that reassurance for parents to have that understanding. And then it creates those appropriate expectations when they have that knowledge. So the first myth. Oh, and by the way, Stephanie and I didn't mention, I'm going to try to allow some time at the end. So if you have questions that you want to ask, just put those in the chat, and Stephanie's going to monitor those questions and pull those together. If there's common ones, we'll address those at the end. So the first myth is, just like the heart is fully developed at birth, the brain is also fully developed. That's a myth, right? So it used to be, and I think it's beginning to be more common knowledge that the brain is developing after birth, that it isn't fully developed at birth. But it's as I said, it's becoming more common that people realize this, but it is not fully common knowledge yet. And that's the goal of the work I do with Brain Insights, is I tell everyone, my goal is only to reach everyone, right? We need everyone to understand all of this information, because then we can support programs and policies and services, and we can get voters and decision makers and everyone understanding to support all that is needed for optimal development that we all benefit from ultimately, right? So, so as I said, we need all of this to become common knowledge, just not a few people having this understanding. So when we realize that the brain isn't fully finished developing at birth, we can think about how most of brain development happens after birth. So by age 3, about 85% of the brain is developed. And by age 5, 90% of the brain is developed. And you probably already know that information. And it is, I am finding that it is becoming more common that people are beginning to realize that the brain doesn't complete development until about the mid to late 20s. So those early months and the early months and years are considered the 4th trimester. So a baby is really born prematurely. You know, they are not ready. Their brain is not completely ready for the world. But biologically, a child's brain is too large. We can't continue to grow and have a woman deliver a baby at the time that they really should be delivered. So it's considered the 4th trimester. And now, as I said, we know that the first 60 days are the time that we have the most influence. And I'll, again, get into more of the detail about that as we go on. So helping parents realize that the brain isn't fully developed yet, and we have that which provides us with the opportunity to have that positive influence on that development. So this is the point that I was getting to, that in 2018, you don't have to read this whole slide if you want to take a screenshot or something, but in 2018, Bruce Perry and others did research because they wanted to determine, is there a time of developmental adversity having an impact on children, is that has more of an impact on children than at other times in development? And what they found was that, yes, that if a baby has consistent nurturing, timely responsiveness in the first 2 months, and then maybe a lot of adversity happens afterwards, that baby that has that consistent, timely, nurturing responsiveness in the first 2 months is going to do better than the baby that has had adversity for the first 2 months, and then the nurturing begins happening after that. So that baby that had the nurturing, and then even if there's adversity afterwards, does better. So that's why it's so important that we share this information and this realization that we can have such a positive impact by providing that nurturing that children require, especially in those first 2 months. So I told you I'm not going to talk about high levels of neuroscience, but what I am going to do is talk about 4 major brain areas. And you might be familiar with these, but it's really, really helpful for parents to have this understanding, because that's what creates those appropriate expectations. So when a baby is born, the only part of their brain that is fully finished developing is their brainstem. And that's in a full-term baby. A full-term baby, their brainstem is the only part that is fully finished developing. And that's the area that regulates heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, body temperature, keep us alive, the survival areas of the brain. So when you think of a preemie and the kinds of things that we have to provide for a preemie, it's those things, right? Keep them warm, monitor their heart rate, help them with breathing, all of those things, because the brainstem isn't fully finished developing yet, and that's the reason. So the next area to complete development, the brain develops from the bottom up, and so the next area to complete development is called the midbrain, and it's located in the middle of the brain, so it's not so complicated, is it? So that midbrain is an area that helps to regulate sleep patterns. So as that part of the brain develops and matures, that's why sleep patterns begin to get more regular. With a newborn, that sleep is kind of all over the place. It isn't on a regular schedule yet. But as the midbrain, as I said, gets further developed, now the sleep patterns become more regular. And that's when we will know, predict the morning nap will be, or the bedtime will be. And then there's another area right next to the brainstem that's called the cerebellum that regulates balance. And so that's another critically important part of the brain to develop. And that's why babies aren't able to sit up, until that area of the brain is more regulated, and they tip over very easily, right? And even with walking, that balance has to be developed. So then the next area of the brain to complete development is called the limbic system. And the limbic system is what we would consider the emotional area of the brain. And it's an area, the main memory area. There's many memory areas of the brain, but this is the main memory area as well. So memory and emotion are really, really closely connected. So if a child is feeling good and safe and secure and having fun or positive interaction, they're going to remember what they're experiencing better. And then the last area of the brain to develop is called the cortex. And I know I'm going through this really quickly because a lot of you probably already know this, but just sharing these details with a parent is so, as I said, very, very beneficial. So the last area of the brain to complete development is called the cortex, and that's considered the thinking area of the brain. And in healthy development, the cortex should end up with the most brain cells and the most connections in it for optimal functioning and well-being in life. Now, the very last, well, let me make a point before I go on. Those two bottom areas, the midbrain and brainstem, are where our stress response systems are activated. So if the limbic system is feeling threatened, it sends out an alert, and the messages go downward to the midbrain and the brainstem to do fight or flight or freeze. And so if we're doing fight or flight, the heart rate's going to increase, the blood pressure is going to increase, our motor skills are going to kick in so we can fight or flee that situation. So that's what's going on in that lower area of the brain. And I'm going to make another point about this in a bit. The very, very, very last part of the brain to complete development is considered or is called the prefrontal cortex. And so with this myth, if left alone, babies will learn to self-regulate. I'm sure you've heard that one, right? And it refers to that crying it out that was on an earlier slide. If babies are left alone, they'll learn to self-regulate, right? Well, that's not true. That's why it's a myth. Because the prefrontal cortex is the area that helps a child learn to be able to develop, to be able to self-regulate. When that prefrontal cortex is fully finished developing, it allows us to prioritize thoughts, gives us the ability to imagine, to think in the abstract, to anticipate consequences, to plan, to control impulses, regulate behavior, and delay gratification. So those are all skills we want the children and ultimately adults to be able to have, right? So that area of the brain, when it is fully finished developing, it becomes in charge. It takes control of those lower areas of the brain. That's what regulates the brain when it is fully finished developing and mature. But as I said, the brain doesn't complete development until about the mid to late 20s. So this last part of the brain doesn't complete development until about that age. Now, I need to make the point that all of it is developing all along the way. So even though the brainstem was the only part that was fully finished developing at birth, all of these areas are developing all along the way. And things that are taking place in infancy are impacting the prefrontal cortex to work on that development of self-regulation and these other skills. So this, as I said, is so helpful for parents to realize. So thinking about a 2-year-old that's having a meltdown in the grocery store, which many of us have experienced either ourselves or observed, right? That's because they don't have the ability to self-regulate. They don't have the ability to control their impulses yet and deal with those big emotions that they're having because their prefrontal cortex is still very immature. So it helps, as I said earlier, with those appropriate expectations. Oh, my child is having a meltdown because they don't know how to, we call it out of control behavior, because they don't know yet how to control their emotions, their big emotions when they're overwhelmed or dysregulated. So if a baby is left alone, they will not learn to self-regulate. It's not physically possible for that child to do yet. So maybe some of you have seen this. It's called the hand model. It's developed by Dr. Dan Siegel, and it's a wonderful way to share this understanding with parents. So the hand model is that to replicate or give a simulation of the brain. So you think of the wrist as the brainstem. You think of the palm as the midbrain. You curl your thumb over, and that represents the limbic area, that emotional and memory area. And then you curl your fingers over the top to represent the cortex. And right behind your forehead, that's where the prefrontal cortex is. And so it's a good model, like he says, it's a handy model, right? So it's a good model for helping parents grasp that understanding of those portions of the brain. And then the other part of it is when a child is dysregulated and having a meltdown, he calls it flipping their lid. And this part of the brain, that part that is going to self-regulate and plan and control impulses and all of that, is offline. It's not available now. All of this is going on, and they're down in that stress response system area. And that's when it's important for the adult in the child's life to co-regulate, keep get to their calm place, because sometimes when a child is having a meltdown, it's hard to be in that place, right, of calm yourself. Your lid might be flipped as well, but take a deep breath and being there for that child and being in that calm space and helping them work through their big emotions so that they are having the experience of regulation, and it's contributing to the development of that prefrontal cortex. So the next myth is babies are too young. They don't know what's happening. Have you heard that one? Yeah, that one's a common one as well. So this statement, I mentioned the decade of the 90s. This statement was in Newsweek magazine in 1996 to share that early childhood experiences exert a dramatic and precise impact, physically determining how the intricate neural circuits of the brain are wired. So it's stated in that way, but really all that's saying is it's the early childhood experiences that are physically affecting and growing the brain, the wiring in that brain. So babies are not too young to know what is happening. They don't consciously process what is happening, but it's physically wiring in their brain. So they are not too young to be influenced by experiences. It's exactly what is influencing them. So I have become known for this simulation that I do. I use, and this is something you can, if you choose to, you can share with parents as well, that I use styrofoam balls and pipe cleaners, as you can see in the image there. And we are born with about 86 billion brain cells. And those 86 billion brain cells are not connected yet. Those 9 months of prenatal development is not enough time to make all of these connections. So it's those experiences that a child has, because the brain is dependent on experiences to make these connections happen. So I use these balls to represent 2 of those 86 billion brain cells, and then make connections with these pipe cleaners to represent what is happening when a child has an experience. So a baby is having skin-to-skin contact, and it's creating that connection. A baby is talked to, and it's creating a connection. A baby is rocked, and it's having a connection. A baby is having a massage, and it's creating a connection. A baby gets hit by a rattle from their big brother, and it creates a connection. The next door neighbor's dog scares the baby, and that's creating a connection. So all of the experiences a child has is creating a connection. And if we just keep going, you can see that the brain physically grows and develops as a result of the experience that it is dependent on. So I'm going to make one more connection. I always have to add kisses from grandma. I have 5 grandchildren now. So the brain physically grows and develops based on experiences. So helping parents realize what you're doing every day with your baby is having a positive influence. And now I tried to do that very quickly, as quickly as I could, but not as quickly as the brain. The brain is making these connections, and in these early weeks, days, and months, and years, at a rate of 1 million per second. Did you know that one? 1 million per second. They used to say 800 a second, and I thought that was a lot. And now scientists are saying it's 1 million a second. The next myth is babies are completely resilient. And that's another one that's quite common, right? Oh, babies are resilient. Well, let's look at this statement. So this first part of the statement is, and that's why you do the work that you do. It states, regardless of the general environment, all children need stimulation and nurturance for healthy development, right? You know that. If these are lacking, or if a child's caretakers are indifferent or hostile, a child's brain development may be impaired. Because the brain adapts to its environment. So because the brain adapts to its environment, it will adapt to a negative environment just as readily as it will adapt to a positive environment. So whatever type of experiences are occurring, especially repeated experiences, whatever experiences are happening repeatedly in that child's life, that's what's going to wire in that child's brain. So that's why we have this wonderful opportunity, because the brain is developing primarily after birth, and we have the opportunity to provide those most positive experiences for that brain to adapt to. So what happens after these experiences or these connections are created, if, as I mentioned, if they're repeated experiences, that strengthens the connection. If it's happened over and over and over again, the brain strengthens those connections, and then it creates something called myelin. And this is a plastic tubing that I use to represent the myelin. And myelin is a fatty, waxy substance that coats the connections that have been made by those experiences. And it makes the information transmit from one brain cell to the other brain cell much more efficiently and quickly. And it holds that connection in place stronger. And it's called pathways, which I'll talk about in a second. So this is also why a baby is so much more susceptible to being shaken prior to that myelin being coating those connections. They're so much more susceptible to brain damage, because those connections aren't protected with that myelin. So these are actually called pathways, brain pathways, just like on the ground. If we go over and over the ground repeatedly, a deep path is worn, correct? So that's what's happening in the brain too. If an experience happens over and over and over again, the brain holds on to that connection and keeps it strong. If it doesn't happen very frequently, what happens is the brain prunes and eliminates some of those connections so that it can adapt to what happens most frequently in their life. It can adapt to the environment and the experiences that happen most frequently, and eliminate the ones that don't happen very frequently. So the brain's saying, oh, this happens a lot in my life. I guess I need to know how to handle this. I guess I need to know how to deal with this. I guess I need this skill. So whatever is happening most frequently, the brain is going to adapt to and wire strongly pathways based on those repeated experiences. So if you think about going over the fence and going in through the grass in the other direction, the first time you go that way, not much would happen, right? Or a path wouldn't be created just from one time going that direction. But if you were to go that way repeatedly, a new pathway would be created. And that's what's going on in the brain. New experiences are creating new pathways as well. Now, the brain is always changing and always readapting and reorganizing. So if this strong pathway is one that was developed through experiences that are not positive, what we can do is create those new experiences. But the thing is, like I said, creating those new experiences doesn't create that new pathway immediately. And it doesn't make the old pathway go away immediately either. So it takes a lot more time and patience and consistency and repetition to change a pathway that was already established. So we know that with some of our, like maybe we haven't been exercising enough, and we have this pathway of of choosing not to exercise. And we want to create this new routine. Well, that old pathway is still very strong, right? We need to go the new direction to have that old pathway be eliminated. So again, that's something that's really helpful for parents to realize, that we have that opportunity to make the most positive, provide the most positive experiences initially, so that we don't have to make those changes later. So, and this is kind of a fun one after you're making those points, is to ask them to write their name. Just ask them, jot down your name, please. And after they do that, then ask them to write their name again using their non-dominant hand. And you can make the point then, why was that more difficult? Ask them, why was that more of a challenge? Well, it's because they have a strong pathway worn in their brain for writing with their dominant hand. You hardly even have to think about it, right? But when you write with your non-dominant hand, that pathway hasn't been, that task hasn't been done repeatedly enough to create a strong pathway. So it's a helpful activity, hands-on activity, to help make that point clear. All right, I mentioned about that I was going to talk about the cortex ending up with the most brain cells in it, most connections and brain cells in it for optimal development. And this slide is representing the neurosequential model that was developed by Dr. Bruce Perry. Hopefully many of you are familiar with Dr. Perry. He actually was we collaborated, the advocacy agency that I mentioned that I worked with, collaborated with Bruce to develop the trainings that we were doing initially in the late 90s and early 2000s. So this is just showing those 4 areas that we talked about, that the brainstem should end up with the least number of connections and brain cells in it, the midbrain the next largest amount, the limbic area the next largest amount, and the cortex should, as I said before, end up with the most connections in it for optimal healthy development. So that brings us to this myth: repeatedly responding to and picking up a crying baby will spoil them. Oof, have you heard that one a lot? Yeah, and it's shared a lot on the internet too, and social media. So that, of course, is a myth. It's not going to spoil them. That's exactly the opposite of what they need. That's a threatening, scary situation for a baby, to be left crying alone. They need someone to respond to them. It's survival. They can't do anything on their own. So they need somebody. They express their need for somebody to come and respond to them, right? So what happens is, if a baby is left to cry repeatedly, that survival part of that brain, is that lower functioning brainstem area, is getting overdeveloped. It's having so many repeated experiences of not being responded to, that survival area of the brain is getting overdeveloped. And that regulation area is second to that ratio. And then the social emotional is even less. And the cognitive, that the cortex and prefrontal cortex is developed smaller, because it's lack of those experiences that baby needed. So it's just the opposite, that responding to a baby is going to support the optimal development of a child, and is the opposite of spoiling that child. So some of the beliefs along with that is that they need to learn that right away, or they're going to adapt or they're going to get dependent on people responding to them. That's what they need. They are dependent on people responding to their needs. So This is a study that I was very excited to find, that was developed or came out in a report in 2010, that showed, and I'll just explain it without reading it to you, but what they found is that they took amniotic fluid from pregnant mothers at about 7 months to determine how much cortisol, the stress hormone, was being exposed to those babies. And then they followed those children to find out, did those children that had high cortisol exposure find, or was it correlated with developmental delays? And what they found is that, yes, that was the case. However, the reason I'm excited about this finding is that if a child had that prenatal cortisol exposure, but was responded to and had that nurturing responsiveness and were able to develop a secure attachment, the kids, as it says at the bottom here, that cortisol exposure and the kids' cognitive development was eliminated. The link, that negative link between that cortisol exposure and their cognitive development was eliminated. It's amazing to even use that word, eliminated, right? So that demonstrates how critically important that nurturing is, right? That nurturing that you're providing and that you're advocating for and that you're supporting. And yeah, that study just is one of my favorites. Another myth is that all babies are alike in their development. You know that, right? In your work with babies, they are not all alike in their development. In the book, Early Childhood and Neuroscience, there was the quote, "I found that identity does not mean knowing your place," that should say in society, sorry about that. Identity is knowing yourself as a person without comparison. And in a quote from What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, that's where it was revealed, that research on the first 2 months was revealed in that book. And that in that book is the quote, "Each of us creates a unique worldview shaped by our life experiences." So it is experiences, as we've been talking about, that wires the brain. And every single one of us is having entirely different experiences. So there's parental influences, there's genetic influences, there's experiencing the same things differently. So two children listening to a story being read to them are experiencing things differently. They're processing what they're hearing and thinking about, and reflecting back on experience they've had. So everyone is can experience the same experience differently. Labeling children has that impact. Gender, birth order, all of it is having that influence on self-perception and that development of that child. And then next is, the myth is, it is best to keep focusing on the next stage of development. Is that really the best thing to do? Oftentimes parents are, okay, now they've mastered this, now they need to work on this. Let's keep, I'm not saying that is not important to be thinking about and providing experiences that are going to lead to that next step of development. However, we need to realize that every child is beautifully unique. I love this quote. "Children are not things to be molded, but are people to be unfolded." I actually shared that on social media this week, and people were loving it. Parents who try to make their child fit their vision of the perfect child usually end up feeling very frustrated. So recognizing and accepting who a baby is increases that calm. So that's the point. recognize where they're at and enjoy it and accept it and value it, value that stage of development. I'm referring to when I say it, not the baby as it. So, so it's not always advantageous to be focusing on, let's get them to this stage, let's get them to this stage, let's enjoy and recognize and accept who they are. And then you might agree with me on this one, that this is a common myth, that for your baby to develop well, you need to have all of the latest products. And mostly what I'm referring to in stating that is that babies are commonly put in containers. You know, that containerized babies has become a common term. So that's not the most advantageous to be putting them in this device and having them be isolated and separated from us. That's not what babies need. Human babies are carry mammals. So they need connection. That's a requirement. It's critical for them. So just like a kangaroo is a carry mammal, so are human babies. They need to be carried. They need that closeness. They need that connection for optimal, healthy development. And they need that free movement as well. So you know all about that, right? And they need to not be restricted in seats and containers. They need that opportunity for that free movement. So, and by carrying a baby, it's providing a lot of different positions and free movement as well, where again, being in a carrier, I call them babies in a bucket, those car seat things, and carrying them around in those and not having touch and missing that face-to-face interaction, and all of that is missed through carrying babies around in those devices. And then along with that is the myth that rocking the baby creates a bad habit. Don't start rocking that baby. They're just going to get used to it, and they're going to want you to rock them all the time. Well, yes, they are, because it's regulating. It's naturally regulating to a baby. And we naturally do it, right? We pick up a baby and we start rocking. We're doing exactly what that baby actually needs. And it's regulating to ourselves. We need that swaying. We need that moving to keep ourselves regulated as well. And providing that swinging, rocking movement in a swing is not at all the same. Again, they're strapped, the movement is restricted, plus they're only in one position consistently, right? So rocking a baby in your arms, you might hold them out like this dad is holding them. And then you might put them up over your shoulder and hold them that way. Or you might do more of the football hold, and they're going to be in different positions, which is going to create the optimal development of some of their senses. So that brings up the myth that the senses of a newborn are far from being fully developed. Lots of people still believe that is true. Now, all of the senses really are well developed, except for sight. That one takes a bit longer, and a child actually has to have visual experiences to make the connections in their brain from the eyes to the visual processing area of their brain. So they do need those experiences from a position of about 8 to 12 inches away. So they need all of these experiences. And a lot of times parents don't realize all of the senses. They might only think of the 5 senses, but helping them realize, and you probably naturally share all of this information already, but it's so important to help parents realize, isn't it, that all that sensory experience that's physically wiring in their brain. And they need to know how they're moving through space. And again, that's why carrying them and rocking them is going to help with that. all of this is essential. And a great site is Sensory Savvy Kids. If you're not familiar with that one, you maybe know others that are valuable as well on this topic. So I'm just going to skip over this slide. If you want to take a screenshot, I'll stop here for a second. But it's so helpful for parents to realize how many senses a baby is experiencing. And one final point. We know puppies need nurturing in the first 8 weeks. We know that. That is common knowledge, right? If a puppy is separated from its mom before the 8-week mark, there is the likelihood that it will be particularly sensitive to psychological and physical disturbances. The separation from their mothers, litter mates, and familiar environments may result in fear, distress, and impaired learning. So let's make the need for nurturing babies in the first 60 days common knowledge also. And here's a list of resources. Again, if you would like to do a screenshot, feel free. Maybe you're familiar with some of these, and I'd love, if you can't take a screenshot, you can email me and I can send you this slide too, because these are some very valuable resources. One I was going to point out to you is Finding Their Feet. That one isn't quite as common. You might be interested in that one in your work. You Are My World is a beautiful book. There's so many good ones. So many good ones here. And of course, I put my first 60 days booklet on that list for you as well. So it feels so good to have you provide support for the understanding of what my brain needs most. Thank you for the significant difference you make through interactions and through sharing. So this is a slide just to give you some information to stay in contact with me. I love connecting with people that are making a difference with babies and children. So, and then this is representation of some of the materials that are on my website, which is braininsightsonline.com. So I want to stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions.